Good morning, or actually good evening. Hello and welcome to everyone on our fourth meeting, the fourth webinar organized by the Polish Humanitarian Action. This is our fourth meeting during which we're going to be considering where hate speech comes from and aggression online comes from. Every single time we use a different perspective and we view things more broadly. We had a meeting with a philosopher, with a psychologist, and the last meeting, last month, was probably the most political, or probably the most social. And today, we are going to talk about the sense of humor and language. Probably the title of the webinar alone, which is, "What, you mean I can't joke anymore?" may seem slightly controversial, considering the times we are in. But, among others, this is what we're going to be discussing. We're going to be talking about whether jokes and whether sense of humor has certain boundaries and what they are, and who is supposed to be setting these limits, and if it's good or if it's bad, and if these boundaries change. So all of that I'm going to be covering with Dr. Margaret Amaka Ohia-Nowak. So hello and welcome to you. Good morning, good evening, and hi. Yes, you're an anti-discrimination trainer, but I understand this is not a full description of what you're doing, and because your professional bio is so broad, I thought that perhaps you could introduce yourself and say what you do. Sure. So, indeed, I am an anti-discrimination coach, and I work in that field very much, but I specialize especially in language and inclusive communication. I'm a linguist, a Polish philologist, and a researcher in examples of discrimination, especially racism in Polish. I'm a coordinator and a manager of the Inclusive Language Center at the Diversity Hub organization. What I do is I hold classes, hold workshops and training seminars, but also lectures, discussions, or meetings on how to talk so that we can include as many people as possible in the communication. It is something that I find very fascinating, trying to see if there are limits to the inclusion, and also seeing what consequences there are to exclusive language, and also seeing the power of language when we're using it in a way that is harmful, but also how powerful language can be when we're using it in such a way to make others feel better, and, we also feel better at that point. So I would like you to explain exactly what you're doing, because that way you're also explain how important language is, right? Because, even though the title of our interview is joking, I would say that sense of humor is a place that offers much freedom. It's a place where we can allow ourselves many things that we cannot do on a day-to-day basis. That, in principle, is something good, but the margin of freedom that we have in jokes and in sense of humor may sometimes be abused, and this is what we will be discussing today. We will be emphasizing language and the role of language. So whether language is just the words or whether language is an instrument where we're shaping our reality and our awareness. So I would like us to start with the question that is in the title, which is, "What, you mean I can't joke anymore?" That is probably a question that we may be hearing often recently in different contexts. It's often like a complaint that these times of political correctness are killing sense of humor and killing jokes. And indeed, in recent years we have seen many social and political events, such as, for example, Me Too, or the Black Lives Matter movement, and these movements made us more sensitive to language. There are some people who would say that we've become oversensitive to language, but those are probably the people who are slightly bothered by this new reality. And that's why I have a question That's why we have to question what you mean we can't joke anymore, because it seems that the borders, the limits of a joke and what we can do when joking have become slightly different. So how do you understand the question, what you mean I can't joke anymore? Do you think it's a principal question or not? I mean, is it justified? I think I can say both yes and no. I mean, it is a justified question because, indeed, as people, we don't like it when somebody forbids us from doing something, and we don't like political correctness. But unfortunately, we often believe that there's no difference between language inclusivity or, we think that the language of empathy and inclusion equals political correctness. Ergo, when somebody forbids us from doing something, this applies not just to Polish culture, but I think it's in the nature of people. We prefer to have freedom. So, in that respect, this question is justified, as the question points out and indicates that, to some degree, when we look at that freedom, there's less of that freedom, which isn't all the way bad, and this constitutes the second part of my response, because to me, freedom of speech ends when the harming the other person starts, when we're entering the domain of sensitivity, or rather, when we're embarking on the sensitivity of the recipient of the joke. And their sensitivity means that I cannot laugh at something anymore. Because, for example, it is something that applies to an attribute of my identity. So today, I would rather not recall specific hurtful jokes because, I don't want to be reproducing or advertising or otherwise promoting these jokes. But, for example, sexist jokes, or racist jokes, or homophobic or transphobic jokes. They may be funny for people who, first of all, lack this kind of sensitivity and are unaware that this can harm others. Secondly, they can be funny, but they don't have to. But they can be funny to the person who doesn't have that attribute, that identity attribute that is being laughed at. And they're not always funny. I'm not saying that they're not funny to everyone who doesn't have that attribute, but they're not going to be funny to someone with a certain attribute, of course with certain exceptions, because it may be that somebody wants to make something funny out of their certain characteristic, and for this example I'm going to use examples of comedians such as Dave Chappelle, Chris Rock, or Trevor Noah, these stand-up comedians, and I have to say that I'm a huge fan of these, and I'm a huge fan, among others, because it's not just because they are able to poke fun at themselves, but because they're touching on such important subjects in their jokes. I think it's okay to joke, but that's when joking does not bring with it the harming of the other person. I know it sounds trivial, but I think it would be useful to dive more deeper into that. I don't think it's trivial at all. It sounds a bit surprising and paradoxical, though, because you used words such as harm and sensitivity. So we should joke in such a way so we don't harm the other person, and that we have to consider other people's sensitivities. I think that, to some degree, this goes against the definition of a joke, because jokes are either sharp, jokes cut, or we can have a black sense of humor, okay? And, jokes, as long as jokes have existed, and to a large extent jokes have been based on stereotypes and have been using them and all these things you're saying, right? You've also mentioned freedom, okay? And you have said that the freedom to say things that... you're saying that the limit to joking and to freedom is that place where we're starting to hurt the other person. And you're saying that sense of humor. Maybe that was my question. My question was the purpose, the function of a joke. And maybe joking and its purpose is changing. Because I think sense of humor and joking in general, this used to be this place, this oasis, this haven where we could allow ourselves to do things that we normally would. I mean, if we really reach back into the past, when we think of royal courts, there's always been a jester, right? And the jester could even offend and insult the king with his jokes, but he didn't take offense because he knew it was just a joke. Yes, that's right. I actually think that jokes and humor and wit, this is something very useful to us and very helpful, and it's necessary, especially in times of crisis. And we've seen much of that recently as well. I mean, you mentioned Me Too and you mentioned Black Lives Matter, but what's happening in the world is not just a social crisis. We're also looking at an ecological crisis and a health crisis, and recently also there's the war. You mentioned that your previous meeting was more political. But all of these events, they are also creating this need to release an emotional tension. And indeed, this function of, unleashing these emotions and freeing them. And it's also about, unleashing these difficult things. This is actually one of the basic purposes of humor. Of course, there are more of these purposes, because in those jokes that I have mentioned before, those racist, sexist, those discriminatory jokes, the ones tied to stereotypes, well, their function is more releasing aggression that is hidden there and that it's dwelling against that quote-unquote other. But there are also many jokes with a sexual subtext, something erotic. This is also about the function of releasing a sexual tension. So these are all ways of dealing with primal instincts, aggression and tension, sexual tension and sexual instincts. So it's also about processing difficult emotions. And in terms of those difficult emotions, it's also a defensive function. We want to defend ourselves. You mentioned black humor, you mentioned political jokes, and there also can be an intellectual function. Like, for example, if we're looking at drawings or memes also have this intellectual function, or in English there's something we call puns. So those are language wordplay jokes where you have a play on words that ends up to be funny. So that humor can also be for the intellectual or, just educational, cognitive function. And then there's another function of humor that I like, which is a cathartic function. It's something that can really clear the air and that can alleviate the tension in interpersonal tension in certain situations. For example, when you have people talking to one another and there's tension and then somebody says a joke, that joke may release the tension. So there's a whole range of positive aspects to joking, because we started kind of by vilifying even the title, which is, what you mean I can't joke anymore, that kind of indicates that we're going to be talking about a specific type of humor, but it's not that. In reality, joking and, jokes are supposed to be funny, right? And laughing is just great, and it's necessary. Yes, laughing is definitely great and necessary, and what you mentioned, yes, sense of humor and jokes, these things are very important because they help us alleviate tension and help us also tame reality. It's something that can help us make reality milder and softer through jokes and through the fact that something scary can suddenly become funny, a bit scary and a bit funny. By the way, there's a saying like that in Polish. But you have just mentioned that it's also about releasing aggression. And this what comes to mind is somebody you mentioned earlier, and that's Chris Rock. Because you mentioned Chris Rock when you were listing the comics that you like, and I just thought that his public joke that he made during the Oscar gala, perhaps we can use his joke as a kind of example of a joke that, well, yeah, that's the question. Did it cross certain lines or not? It definitely sparked aggression in, the audience. Let's just remember the audience that Chris Rock was hosting this year's Oscars. He made a joke at the expense of Will Smith's wife. Will Smith, he's an actor who the same year also received an Oscar. And his wife has, I think he has some kind of a condition that causes her hair to fall out, and Chris Rock made a joke about it. And Will Smith stood up after that joke and used physical violence and hit him on his face. So what went wrong? What kind of a limit was crossed? Because this is something we're talking about. We're talking about what should we not joke about, when to joke, and when a joke becomes abusive. Although in this case, we can see that the violence can actually work both ways, or either way, because it may affect the person whom we're joking at and the person making the joke. That's correct, yes. Chris Rock made a joke about a medical condition. I think the illness is called alopecia. I mean, the condition you mentioned, Will Smith's wife's condition. So that is something that he feels very close about. He can't look at from a distance. We usually laugh about things that we can view from a distance. Something that is, far from us. Or something that has happened in the past. It's not something recent. Or we find something funny if it's unrealistic and impossible. Like, for example, jokes at the start of the pandemic, right? On one hand, the situation took place, but it also seemed so surreal. So you could see, you still see them, but you see them less because it's no longer funny, as it was our reality. We were all in that, and etc. But it was something that, if something happens to somebody else, and if we can view it from a distance, if it happens to someone that we don't have an emotional connection to, then yeah, it's funny. And for Will Smith, that joke, it was not funny, because it was a joke directed directly at someone he's in a close relationship with. Yeah, so when I think of the whole situation, I first of all see the consequences of what the situation generated and what the situation left. For example, people started talking out loud about alopecia. So the fact that, the balding of women, it was something that was talked about. At least it was something that people started talking about in my bubble. It's a pretty simple kind of interpretation. If he was talking about some abstract person, then probably it wouldn't be as funny to the others. By the way, I think the line between humor and harm, or the line between a comedy and a tragedy, is very thin. It is true, as you're saying, that one can lead to the other. On one hand, the aggression or the humor, in a way, released that aggression, but on the other hand, the humor may lead to aggression, and then aggression can also lead to humor. Because after all, there are many jokes that are actually centering on the harm of others. So I would say that it's all jumbled up, and confusing. Between laughter and pain, there's also a thin line. There are also many shared elements between these two. That's true, there are some similarities. For example, sometimes when we're laughing, and the sound of laughter can sometimes be mistaken for the sound of crying. Sometimes we laugh similarly as we cry, and the other way around. And probably there are also many other similarities. I think, however, you said something very important. You said that the line is very thin. Because you see, you said, or at least using the example of the joke of Chris Rock, this joke that generated a certain response in Will Smith, you said that we shouldn't be laughing. No, sorry, you put it differently. You said that we laugh at things that we can see from a distance, from afar. But actually, on the other hand, we laugh to become more distant about something. So there's quite a paradox there, right? That is probably true. Yeah. As I was saying, it is one of the functions, one of the purposes of humor. The goal is to manage something, to process something, and I think they're not mutually exclusive. That's just the case. Yes, and as you said, the line there is very thin. And the question is, what do you think makes a joke sharp, and yet it remains a joke? And what do you think makes that a joke? You know, what makes a joke actually sneak through, sneak across painful content, okay? Because I think that, sense of humor, as you were saying, humor has so many important and air clearing and releasing, liberating functions, but it can also be a way to sneak through, to smuggle things, to things that are painful and improper, but inappropriate in a very hurtful, painful kind of way. So a way of saying things that we would not dare say out loud, but then in a joke, that's fine for us to say it. And at the same time, at that point, the joke, a joke becomes a place in which we sneak through certain things. It's like a conveyor belt through which we may be smuggling through so many negative things. So I think that probably the distinction here is the intent and consequence, right? Right? I mean, in the joke. And maybe we should talk about that because, it's not that one follows from the other. I mean, it's not that the intent and consequence are equal. Sometimes they grow apart, and that's when probably we have a problem. Yes, as in we as people who are using jokes, because we're talking about the joke as an act of communication, but it can be a verbal joke. I mean, a language joke, or it can also be something said. I mean, usually it's said. But jokes can also function as memes. They can be pictures in the internet domain. Or it can be also something that is, it can also be a funny comment. So it doesn't have to be just a traditional joke. Like, we rarely hear those classic jokes, like, knock-knock jokes. But instead, it could also be like a comment that's supposed to say something funny, or it's something that's supposed to bring someone down to something funny. I mean, we have a tendency as language users and as communication users, we are evaluating people based on their intentions, and people explain their actions and they start to say, well, I didn't mean anything negative, I didn't mean that. I mean, no, sorry, my goal wasn't to speak ill of women. People often say that their goal was just to clear the air and to release some tension at work. Like when I was saying a joke about unattractive women. Yeah, and we're getting back to the question, I can't share jokes anymore? And that looks different now, doesn't it? Yes, this is also, I would call this a defensive response that starts focusing on the intentions. It's like, I didn't have anything negative in mind. But actually, when we're looking at it from this communication perspective, then the most important area or the most important aspect of the utterance or the communication act is the consequence, the effect of that utterance. So, the people around me, how they're going to view it, or how the people that I'm saying it to, how they will perceive of it and take it. What's important is what social consequences the joke has. And fine, if me and my friend were sitting down speaking in private, and if I want to tell her something funny and it doesn't resonate with her, or for some reason she's hurt by it or something else, that's one thing. And that is, of course, also not okay. But that's different compared to when I put a meme online that insults a whole social group because it's homophobic, or because it mocks people with disabilities. The thing with memes is that it's not that we can just say them anonymously. I mean, if we don't sign them, then, if you sign them, then it means you're even bolder, and it means you accept it even more. Yeah, it's just about you being bold. But then on the other hand, everything online spreads like a virus, in cyberspace. And memes are a tool that also help us understand the internet and cyberspace. It's especially easier for younger people. But on the other hand, they largely oversimplify reality. Still, the social consequences that humor may have, or joking may have, even if it's done unintentionally, or even if we're sending it or sharing it or saying it unintentionally, the consequences can be disastrous. Because it's what you said in the beginning. The language, or it's not just the words, but it's also about different nonverbal communication and characters. They shape reality. They shape our awareness, and that's one thing. But they also shape what our world looks like. And the question is, do we want to be in a world in which, okay, maybe somebody will laugh at that joke, but then there's a large group of people who will not only feel offended by, but also hurt? When I think about the Raport pyramid, and that's the pyramid of, the Gordon Raport pyramid is like a theoretical scheme that shows the consequences of negative, hurtful language. So hate speech, but hate speech doesn't need to be intentional. It doesn't have to be like, the proper hate speech we think of. It can be just an innocent joke. And that innocent joke leads, maybe I don't have to talk about the whole pyramid, or maybe I will. Yeah, we have time. That's right. Yeah, I just thought that after all, sure, we have a lot of time. This is great because we actually have time to talk here. So, at the base of the pyramid, what you have is there are negative comments, and they can be really innocent in their form. I think that jokes based on stereotypes or hurtful beliefs about a certain group or certain people, specific people, can apply here. By the way, it doesn't have to be a group connected to some kind of identity if we understand it classically. Although Raport based his research and analysis on the process of the Holocaust and actually what happened, starting from the negative stereotypes and starting with negative jokes, going further. Now, the next level of the pyramid is about avoidance. So avoiding a given group or a given people. So first we talk about them negatively, and we may share and disseminate all kinds of negative news and negative information about these people. Or we mock them, we laugh at them, and it doesn't have to be one after another. We may also avoid this group, so we don't... Yeah, in a way, we separate that group. It is a kind of segregation, we could say. It's like ghettoization, etc. And then there may be also that we don't want to have anything to do with these people. Now, the next level is discrimination. So this is worse treatment of these people in the form of policies, but it can also be in the form of me acting differently towards a certain person on grounds of, a certain attribute. This is not just talking, but it's about taking action. On a social level, this is about social exclusion. It's about all kinds of inequalities that may appear. And then we're looking at acts of physical violence. So we're talking about the visible ones. We have to consider this passage from the innocent jokes to physical violence. And at the tip of that pyramid, we have extermination, which is what happened in the Holocaust. So these stages, when we think about that specific historic event, they were definitely visible there. But in contemporary times, we can think about it as different linear elements that are happening, different processes taking place. Because when I think about teenagers, young people that commit suicide in school, I think it all starts with them being mocked. It starts with jokes. I'm talking here about people who are homosexual or people who are transgender. Now, in Poland recently, we've seen many suicides based on that. It's not just based on this background, but there could be people with neurodiversity, people in the autism spectrum. That's another group that is being excluded. And then there are people of different ethnic background than Polish because they're not white, because they have black skin or dark skin. That may be another group that is discriminated against on grounds of the language. And these are also people who experience these innocent jokes. And that's based on how they look, or based on coming from other countries or other cultures. Now, you, for example, have mentioned that, you had a very political interview recently, but I know, but we mustn't forget, and we mustn't overlook refugee children or people from Ukraine and children from Ukraine who are already now, even children from Belarus and children from Russia are currently already experiencing this kind of discrimination through language. And all of that starts at a very innocent level. So when we think about this function, when we think that humor may in the classroom alleviate some tension when the kids are laughing, then that's okay, but the question is, what are they laughing about? We can laugh at so many different things, and we say, well, yeah, but usually we laugh at the things that in a way breach these norms, and they also breach morality. And because of that, this may be difficult. Of course, everyone loves a laugh, but why do we laugh at the expense of another person? I don't understand that, but that requires... Oh, yeah, maybe we can talk about it more. Yes, what you're saying is all very interesting. That's because you use the example of the Holocaust to talk about the pyramid. And, I think to myself that back in the times of my childhood, I can still remember some jokes appearing about the Holocaust. So, at a certain point, these jokes were always controversial, but they came up. I think that with many Polish stand-up comedy acts, probably not just in Poland, probably you can hear these jokes about the Holocaust, right? So, once again, this begs the question, what is the purpose of that joke and probably how it's expressed? Because, I think to myself about the joke, La Vita è Bella, the Life is Beautiful, that was trying to show the Holocaust through the eyes of a little boy. And it was a funny movie, by the way. It was made by a famous Italian comedy actor. But in your story about the pyramid and the Holocaust, what occurred to me and what I thought of as a conversation that I heard about a different tragic event in our history, in our recent history, which is the Rwanda genocide. And I remember the person who was talking about the dynamics of the genocide, and they were saying that genocide is not a process that is only about physical aggression and violence that leads to death and to the extermination of a given ethnic group. No, instead it's a process that takes years, a process that can take 20 or maybe even more years, and it doesn't always have to end with an outbreak of aggression. So probably the example of the Rwanda genocide is now very evocative because indeed in this case words play a huge role. Words and also naming, the fact that one side was labeling the other insects. And also, we all need to consider the role of the radio and the propaganda of hatred. And we all know how disastrously this ended. So this is an example. It's another example, and probably a more recent one than the Holocaust, an example of how words can lay the groundwork for outright aggression, to killing, which is the purest form of hatred. And I think that in these times when we have the internet, and the internet is a place for anonymity, I think when we look at that, then the jokes and the words in general become more dangerous, right? Yes, yes, definitely. And what you just mentioned, which is the comparison of, ethnic groups to insects and parasites, these are all narratives that are still being used, and this is another function or the property of a joke, to take advantage and to use narratives that are functioning and that are often based on the us-them polarization, which is the basic, perhaps psychologists would say that it is the basic function of the brain. It's categorization, okay? We disconnect from the other. But what's more important is, it's social when we're trying to give importance to the others, when we're giving them attributes of inferiority. Okay? Now, I'm thinking now about the socially functioning discourses, and that are also the basis for these jokes. For example, like the group of people experiencing migration or with refugee backgrounds. These are people who are being labeled in certain ways, and they're being assigned many narratives. For example, a narrative of, and by the way, these narratives are often spread by politicians or the media, as you said, and they function in the media. Like, for example, saying that refugees carry disease. In 2015, we could hear that discourse really strongly during the so-called, and I hate calling it that, but okay, let's call it the refugee crisis. But we all know which point I'm talking about when we're talking about a strongly expressed anti-migration policy in Poland, or the fact that the refugees are people who experience migration, or refugees, that they were being referred to as invaders, that what they're doing is an invasion. And there's also new words appearing in Polish, like the word nachodźca, which came up, and which means literally invader. Now, we, of course, as adults, we can try and rationalize it, but as an educator, I always think about the young people and how they soak it up as a sponge. And it's interesting how the word refugee, starting from 2015, has taken on a different meaning. I was meeting with teachers working in schools, and the word refugee in these schools was something that was used as a mockery concept. People would call each other, "You're a refugee," and they would laugh about it. So a refugee was someone worse, someone you can laugh about it, etc. And that was because that narrative about specific refugees, and in this case, Muslim refugees from Syria, from Afghanistan, and also from Iraq. These narratives, by the way, came back last year, especially in 2021. And what I wanted to say is that once again, these are the people who, we may think that these subjects are unrelated, but then on the internet, when people are constantly being bombarded with that, or when people are bombarding one another with it, because, by the way, all of us, we are co-creating the media, at that point these meanings are being disseminated, established, and normalized. I would say that certain jokes, or the so-called innocent meanings that you have also mentioned, meanings that may actually lead to tragic consequences. It's interesting how ubiquitous they are, and at the same time, people very rarely react to them because people don't see the consequences, or they are unable to foresee the effects that the spreading of those meanings may have. And also people don't consider the consequences of online abuse or talking about or spreading violence online can bring. One of the examples for that is the American context. And the most recent shooting, the last one was in Texas, but before that there was a shooting in Buffalo where there was a white 18-year-old who was identifying as a representative of white supremacists, and when he shot many people, and he killed them for his racist beliefs, and he was also recording the event, and he was also talking about it earlier, of course, in his internet bubbles. So now, I feel that we're already, of course, at this point, we're very far from the jokes we're talking about. And based on that, it's easy to see that the line isn't thin at all. But I'm trying to make the point that speaking certain words thoughtlessly, without reflection, voicing certain theories and, swallowing everything that you're seeing, to the young people, it may be difficult. It has to be challenging to them to find the truth in the flood of information and all the different narratives. Yes, now this immediately makes me think when we're talking about the lines, my question is who creates those lines, who draws these lines, and who sanctions a joke as a joke that's funny or as a joke that's innocent, and who decides that certain subjects we shouldn't be joking about or that certain jokes are not funny, but instead that they're insulting. Yeah, who makes that decision and how does that change? Because, of course, if we compare things that we are laughing about, maybe not even a long time ago, not 100 years ago, but even 10 years ago, or maybe even 15 years ago, then I would say that many of these things are no longer funny now. And how does that happen, if you can tell me? And who's behind it? Are we behind it? Or is there my question is it more the intent or the consequence that determines whether a joke is funny or not? Well, I like talking about agency and that people have their own agency, okay? And I'm a deep believer in that. I believe that we as people, as a society, we have agency and we can decide about ourselves. Now, unfortunately, our actions are largely self-destructive, but there's also a story there saying that people are becoming more and more mindful of others, and they're trying to hear, and they want to change their reality, probably also because they're seeing the consequences, and because it doesn't make sense to destroy one another, and that it's better to make the effort to stop so that we see beyond just the top of our head, but so that we actually see the other person. Now, one of the examples and by the way, this example may not be directly connected to a joke, but one example of something that is a social opening to the perspective of other people, and these people are a small group, is, the consequence of the Don't Call Me Murzyn campaign conducted by a friend of mine from Black is Polish. The African Polish who are starting to talk about the M word, which is hurtful. A word that was used in many situations in jokes about people of black skin or people of African descent. And those jokes were hurtful to us not just because the M word was used there, but because it communicates an attribute of our personality and mocks it, or in a way caricatures it, and etc. But they're starting to share their experiences. They're starting to talk about it online. And they're talking about it in a language that is simple, a language that also reaches the recipients, because it's not like a science that a couple of people used to do before and later they talked about it for a dozen years. It's not traditional media. Instead, it's also videos. And it's a direct way of saying why the word hurts us. And not just us, but people like us. People who speak Polish, who were born in Poland, and they're not from the other corner of the world, and they didn't suddenly decide that, hey, you know what, we should ban this word. No, this is a word that actually touches our emotions, and we don't want that word to be used. And at that point, people start to listen. Now, in 2020, I remember it was 2020 when the news starts to spread and it becomes multiplied, and it is also spread by other African Polish. And they're starting to say that, yeah, exactly, I feel the same way. And more people start hearing that. And even though previously you had linguists talking about it, but then you had the Council of the Polish Language taking a stance, and they did so more firmly than what they said before, and they were simply saying that this word is discriminatory, and they're advising against using that word. I think when you're asking who makes these decisions, then on one hand, this largely starts at the bottom, because when we're talking about changes, it starts bottom up, from the people who are using jokes or using language and etc. And on the other hand, the other force is the top-down instance. An authority figure can say something. We, as Polish people, we have this tendency, we don't listen to authority, we love freedom. And if somebody tells us, hey, listen, don't use that word without any explanation, without a follow-up, without giving also a more emotional input. And I'm not saying that it reached everybody, but it definitely reached many people who had before that used that word. So it's not just about the intention, that you don't have negative intentions when you're using the M word in Polish, but it would be good for you to hear out that, this word is hurtful to me because of how it was used before. And me, as a linguist, I have other linguistic arguments. For example, the word comes from the ancient Polish murzyć, which means to dirten, to blacken. And I don't want to be labeled that way. And the word has many connotations, many linguistic meanings that are negative, that are established in a negative way. So all of that, when you put it together, because the language and the language norms, that is a big authority, especially for the Polish people. I mean, we Polish people were really attached to traditional Polish, and we stick to that. So to some people, this authority of the norm is going to be powerful, and this is leading to change. What is important is that this change never is a revolution. By the way, the change in the language is never a revolution. It is an evolution. It's like you said, 10 years ago, the jokes that used to be funny aren't funny anymore, but it's more of an evolution. I mean, 10 years is not a lot of time, but as far as civilization goes, we may say that on the communication level, 10 years is like the last 100 years. And that's because in communication, there's been so many changes. 10 years ago, you couldn't use a smartphone with internet access anywhere. You couldn't just go abroad and you couldn't have internet for free. I think that wasn't even available 4 years ago. So look at this. We're living in times when there's so many changes and when 10 years is really long. And it indeed is an evolution. I think it's going to be evolution and progress instead of regress. And that's because we are living in all these different contexts, and sometimes these contexts are very distant. We're living in different bubbles, and we don't know what's happening in the other bubbles, and it actually is difficult to get out of our bubbles, to convince somebody else to perhaps change their, at least language-based habits. It's so interesting because you're saying that the language is like a living entity. It's a living being. It's not static and it keeps changing, which also is shown in all the dictionaries in the world. If we compare the Polish dictionary from now and 100 years ago, we're going to see a tremendous number of differences because, the way we live, technology and politics and social change and cultural changes are also affecting language. And also before Google, nobody used the word Googling, right? And then on the other hand, yes, although those things are pretty simple, because in this case we can very easily connect that, right? But much like with technological novelties or changes, maybe, either enriching language or the opposite, probably depending how you view it, but, definitely they're changing language, and surely there's also social changes affecting language. So going back to the question as to who decides, there's a very interesting example that you said, which is "don't call me Murzyn," which is interesting because it's in English, "don't call me," and also it comes from the group that feels affected by it. This means that we should listen to the people who are feeling affected. So the decision belongs to that group. I mean, I'm immediately thinking of something here that is really very present day, really very up to date, and that is also connected to language and politics. So whether we should be saying in Polish na Ukrainie or w Ukrainie, on the Ukraine or in Ukraine. I mean, for many years we used the form na Ukrainie without any negative intention. But now, after February 24th, after Russia's aggression to that in that country, people started saying w Ukrainie in Polish instead of na Ukrainie, because when you say na Ukrainie, it kind of suggests linguistically that it is not a sovereign state, that it's a country that has been part of Russia. At least you're doing that in the linguistic sphere. And of course, often there are critics who keep saying, wait, but we should be preserving the purity of the Polish language, and language should be free of politics, and language should rather be subjected to the rigors of grammar and linguistic norms, because after all, we also say on Hungary, na Węgrzech, and by saying that, we're not implying in any way, right, that Hungary is not an independent state, right? So, yes, so I think that any of these arguments can be broken down and analyzed, and we can provide arguments to favor one or another position. But one point that convinces me very much is something that you raised. It's about how we would like, the Ukrainians to be talked about, and if they want us to say w Ukrainie, then to us, it's just a change of a tiny little detail in our language, but that tiny detail in our language may change awareness. And first of all, it is something that matters to this group. And probably that is the answer to the question, who sanctions or who has impact and whom we should be listening to on these matters. Yes, this is actually called perlocutio in linguistics. That's for the people who are interested. Maybe you, Agata, are also interested in that phenomenon. This is about the reception of a communicative act and the act of, speech. But of course, it's about the outcome of what I say, the effect of what I say on the recipient. So the effect of the text or my utterance on the person that is listening to me, or the person that I'm directing the message to, but also who the message is about. So yes, indeed, this is a very contemporary approach to communication, because those anachronic, obsolete, more traditional, or maybe classic approach is okay, because actually what is a classic approach is that what's most important is the speaker, and the speaker's intention are more important. However, it's not always that our thoughts, or actually, the recipient never reads our thoughts. They are reading our thoughts through the signals that enable us to express the thoughts, okay? So the example that you mentioned, w Ukrainie and na Ukrainie, is excellent. Although linguists, and from a linguistic perspective, it's not. That w Ukrainie is an erroneous form. It's not a mistake. I mean, you can actually, that can be verified in the Council of the Polish Language, and also the linguistic guidebook by the Polish publishing house has also presented their stance on the matter. So anyway, the social function of the language in this case, and in this specific example, is going to be key. Okay, so you're talking about the social function of language, which is so interesting, as in what is the social function of language? Because we often say, it's just words. It's nothing more than that. Reality aside, and words only name this and call reality. Would you say that this is true, that our words only name reality, or is it something more, or is it about co-creating reality? Well, Desmond Tutu actually said once, he said a couple of sentences. For example, he said that language is a very powerful matter. He said, language is very powerful, and he also said that language describes reality. But it does more than that. It also shapes reality. And that's because language, as I was saying before, it creates reality it is a form of action, by the way. Our words, as we speak them, words have their consequences. Indeed, innocent jokes, and by the way, getting back to our subject of today, quite often jokes related to an identity attribute, they are talked about as microaggressions, they're called micro-exclusions. It's actually not even seen as a joke anymore, but with whose purpose would be to, relieve the tension or to just make someone laugh. But instead, the function of those is seen as exclusion. And it's this unintentional, concealed exclusion. So us, through certain innocent words or through certain combinations of stereotypes and stereotypical utterances and through certain comments, we may be excluding people. And also, these microaggressions, they are very thoroughly researched. They have been researched through interviews and different kinds of interview research processes, and they're mostly studied by psychiatrists and psychologists. But in psychology and psychiatry, yes, they're a field of interest, and there are so many harmful consequences of microaggressions. There's anxiety, paranoia, trouble sleeping. I'm talking here about the consequences of the people who are suffering, who are the victims of microaggressions. And microaggressions are, for example, exclusive jokes, lowering self-esteem and lower daily energy in life, and also a loss of social trust. So this means that I simply start avoiding people because based on how I look or based on, having a bigger size or wearing glasses in the case of children is the reason for that. It could be different attributes of my look or my identity. Or once again, at school, it could be tied to lower social status, or it could be, being from a rural background. This leads to helplessness, leads to intrusive thoughts, and it may lead to difficulties, as I said earlier, with concentration and difficulty sleeping. So there are psychological, psychosomatic, and also social consequences. Namely, that person starts to have difficulties functioning socially. They start feeling nervous and upset, and that leads to them constantly thinking if they're going once again to experience this. I'm right now talking about the context of, when I'm working with businesses, companies, and this sometimes happens that I'm working with them at a workplace, So how we talk about how experiencing such a joke at the workplace can lower our job performance and can make us reluctant and can lead us to burnout. Another thing is that with these jokes, these even innocent jokes or comments, it is very difficult to respond to them, especially at the workplace, because we're afraid we're going to lose our job, or we are afraid that we will be viewed as the oversensitive one or as the too aggressive one. If, for example, we choose to react to what somebody's saying. So yes, there are very many of these consequences, of these unpleasant ones, of these jokes. There's day-to-day consequences. It's so interesting because you're talking about microaggressions, and yeah, it's so innocent, right? It's called micro, so it's small, but probably because of that it's more dangerous, as it's barely noticeable. It's so difficult to call it and to capture it, because if a form of aggression or if a form of abuse, of violence is more direct, more straightforward and explicit, we can describe that and we can complain about it, right? We can point to the person harming us. But if it's micro, all right, if it's micro, then it can be so dangerous as it's impossible to grasp it, and you can't, because of that, it becomes it becomes out of control, right? Wouldn't you say? Yes, microaggressions are compared to mosquito bites. They are compared to these everyday stings. I can say that the harmfulness is caused mostly not by the power, because those are micro events. They are very subtle and small, but the problem comes from their frequency. They occur just so often. And even if they don't affect us directly, even if we just hear them, they may still produce these consequences. So if there's somebody at work, let's say we have a coworker who constantly uses a certain word, or let's say we have a classmate or somebody in our group if we're at university, somebody who keeps, saying things about how, a certain girl, let's say they say they share sexist jokes, okay? So even if that doesn't apply directly to me, if this still applies to a group that I'm a member of, or if I am close to that person, it will affect me either way. And indeed, it is something true that it's hard to respond to these effectively, because that causes concern. Yes, you've mentioned the negative consequences of language because we're talking about the social function of language. What about the positive ones? What are the good things that language can do in social life and our surroundings? How can we use language to change the world? Yes, well, language, as I was saying earlier, has enormous power. It also has the power of micro-inclusion. Sometimes all that is enough is not to say certain things. It's enough to eliminate from our vocabulary verbs such as życzyć, to Jew, or verbs from words such as gypsy, some of the ones that are referring to anti-Romani or anti-Semitic stereotypes or anything else that goes against a certain ethnic group. We should consider when we use expressions such as, women's talk, okay? We have to consider avoiding comments that may seem on the surface funny, or instead of calling someone, oh, that Jew, he won't even contribute and chip in to the gift. So it can be those anti-Semitic comments. It's sometimes enough to eliminate that. And I think that's actually the first step. The first step is considering how my language practice, I was actually supposed to talk about the positive consequences instead of how to change the language, but the positive consequences come once you are making individual level changes. I deeply believe that. I believe that the change in the practices of an individual may bring about a change. And these benefits are that, social functioning will improve. Now, I don't like to promote, and I'm not the right... Okay, you know what? Actually, I do enjoy promoting a more inclusive language. Sometimes eliminating an exclusive language itself, that in itself can make other people around us feel safer and can make them just have better well-being. And with that, we will not have to deal with the adverse consequences, as I mentioned. And I believe that the sole fact of someone not experiencing anxiety or paranoia or difficulties, that in itself may be a positive consequence. But language also creates a community. Therefore, the consequences of, in the context of in conversation, it's about building a community, and through jokes and humor, you can also create a community. And you create a community through shared and non-harmful laughter. Although, in the context of what humor and what wit and jokes are and what jokes are funniest, this isn't easy at all. It's not easy for us all to be laughing not at someone or at something that may be harmful to someone or about a problem. This is actually a huge challenge, but it is possible. So the community, the creation of ties and relations, I see this as one of the steps to building a better world, a world without violence, or a world in which violence is something that we can deal with without violence. But it can be dealt with differently, for example, through empathy in relation to ourselves. Yes, So you're talking about how difficult this is because once again, the line can be very thin, right? And once again, even though someone has the best intentions, despite the best intentions, we may bring about consequences different than what we intended. So, something that may be seen by one person as, okay, mindfulness of language, somebody else may call it censorship, all right? But maybe the word be mindful is important here because it's not that we know everything. And it's not that we are completely perfect. And it's not that we never accidentally offend people because, as you have said, there are so many ways in which we can offend people, and sometimes we may do it unintentionally. I mean, just colloquially speaking, someone may say, well, this is a dress for an old hag or an old woman, and there's an older woman standing next to us, and even though we're saying this to just our friend, without having an intent to offend someone, we may still make someone feel offended and hurt, and I think it does happen anyway. So, in order to manage and to deal with that very thin line and the different pitfalls, I think what's important is this day-to-day mindfulness, okay? Just to be mindful and just to pay attention to that, for this to be like a habit of ours, for it to be our kind of routine. Yes, definitely. Definitely, there's a certain theory that talks about positions in life, in the transaction analysis, and the ideal position in life is when, I'm okay and you're okay. So that means that between us there are no inequalities. So striving to that position, or actually trying to change your attitude from, me being great and you being terrible, and then that is the position of these jokes, okay? I rather don't joke about myself. I mean, I can joke about others. And because we are rather here talking about a situation in which we are leveling these positions, leveling my position and the position of the other person. And for that, you need not just mindfulness of the other person, but to be mindful of the other person, you first have to be mindful of yourself. So by this, we need to constantly go back to thinking about what I'm trying to say at that moment, and also considering what we need. That is not easy. For example, when we say, okay, Wojtek is acting autistic today, okay, this, by the way, doesn't apply to a person who is within the autism spectrum, or some other utterances or some other jokes like that. So that may mean that I need community, or I need for the group to like me because I just need a relationship with others in the group, and perhaps I could do it differently than by referring to a stereotype or a hurtful meaning or mocking someone specific or not. So the answer to this is that this mindfulness is something that we can learn, but it is something we are learning. It's not something we're born with. Right. Well, yes, I think we're just born with a mindfulness of ourselves and our needs. But to be mindful of the other person, that's something you learn. I guess through our socialization and through our education, we don't really learn that because we don't have classes in this kind of mindfulness. And I'm not talking about, mindfulness as in meditation. That's part of that. I'm talking about something you mentioned. So stopping to consider, taking a pause to reflect upon my linguistic choices, but also this empathy about myself. Like if something slips out, okay, it's not a reason to suddenly become self-critical. Or the other way, to say, oh, what, you mean we can't say anything today? That's a kind of a sentence that belongs in our subject, right? Which is, what, I can't make jokes anymore? I can't say anything anymore? So it's either two sides. Either I'm horrible or the world is horrible. It's not a position of I'm okay and you're okay, but it's a distortion. And we start at that point to lose track. I think that allowing ourselves to make a mistake is also part of the whole process. Oh, because it's also a way to learn, and the only way to learn is also to learn from our mistakes. But I think we need to be prepared to, first of all, notice our mistake, to accept it, and to also want to correct that mistake, right? Yes. And also, it's difficult to hear that we've made a mistake. That's another problem. If we think about it ourselves, that you said something and then in a moment you decided that, you know what, perhaps that wasn't, as you put it, the most fortunate way of putting things, but I could have told that to you as well. So the question is whether you're open to accepting that feedback or whether you're going to say, oh, you know what, I know how to speak better, or, that wasn't my intention at all and that's it. So it's also important to be open to hearing out the other person, because I could have just as well been the butt of that joke. So it's important to be open to, these kinds of mentions that something maybe was wrong. Although, once again, this is not something we learn. The problem is that we don't learn to give this kind of feedback, and I'm talking here about the school stage, okay, of our formal education and development, but also this applies very often to our homes. This is also missing at home, and it is so important. It's important to accept that, not from someone, okay? We shouldn't be thinking that, you're everything you're doing is wrong, it's not okay, or it's not something you should have said. But we need to accept this kind of feedback as guidelines, as tips on making changes. By the way, that's also a cultural thing. We find it difficult to accept that negative feedback, and it's a kind of an art. Yes, I think that probably it's easier to learn this mindfulness in real life. That is, when we're surrounded by people. When we're surrounded by people, it's easier for us to notice that someone's standing next to us, they're older, and maybe we shouldn't be joking and laughing at older people, and maybe there's somebody who's on the other side, they may be slightly bigger, and we shouldn't be also poking fun at anyone's obesity. And later down the road, we may have this thought that, we shouldn't ever be poking fun of it, because there are people out there for whom this is a big struggle. So all of these subjects of jokes that may have negative consequences and that may be hurtful. Now, when we're in real life, when we're among people, when we're looking into another person's eyes, it becomes easier. It's easier to hear the other person. It's easier to see a response and to accept a response. However, I think in the virtual space, this becomes more challenging because we are anonymous, so we have impunity, but the environment is also anonymous because we do not know who is on the other side. And this is probably an even bigger challenge. It's so big that, especially larger, as today a huge chunk of our communication takes place in the virtual space. There's all of those instant messengers, there are so many of them. I can't list all of them because new ones keep popping up, and this can be a tremendous challenge. The challenge is, how do we learn this sensitivity or this mindfulness on the internet? Because that's probably something else altogether, right? That's actually a very difficult question. I mean, maybe you have some ideas, because honestly, the way I think about it is that on the internet, and also if we consider the viral character of the internet, a hurtful joke or hateful language, it's amplified and it's commented on, it's disseminated, it's shared everywhere, and then people like it, and etc. But then on the other hand, we can also learn to have that agency online. And for example, we may report content like this. We may report content that is so harmful that we may report it. Because, by the way, that's another problem. We don't have a category for reporting. I mean, we don't have this socially formed pathway for I mean, we don't have institutions or organizations in Poland to which we can report jokes that are somehow on the line. You always need to prove that this is a joke. I mean, if it is a joke, that it may have consequences, and that it's difficult to do that. It is difficult to do that because the intention of the joke is usually just humor. The whole point is to make another person laugh and etc. But you know what we could do? I think that we can also awaken our mindfulness to such utterances, and we can report them directly to the social media, or we can respond if we have the energy for that, because we don't always have the resources for that. And if we do, and on the internet it may happen that we have more resources than face-to-face. You know, we can provide feedback, and at that point we're not talking about individuals writing things or sending memes, because we usually don't know who it is, but we can instead talk about why we're disagreeing with something. And this is also what I would like, at least. I would like this to work in the other way, for information to be spread virally in this kind, as in information that is a response to hateful communication. So it would be great if there was a viral character of feedback, of responses to hateful speech. Now, as for the internet-based tools and tools for online action, there really aren't that many for that. And me and my colleagues, and me and the members of the organization that, as part of that we created to help black people from Ukraine, and we were actually wondering about how do we develop a tool that would fight hate speech directed at black people and people of a different background than ethnic background than Polish appearing online. And we were considering ways to respond. There are attempts at developing applications to which one can report different kinds of examples and incidents of hate speech or hate crime even, but that won't be done online. But the internet also provides us with tools for responding. But I think what I wanted to say about internet communication in general, and those meetings, those online meetings, and also online contacts, then there's something positive that was noticed recently, namely that we're seeing fewer jokes of those traditional kind that we were discussing at the beginning of the conversation. So because nowadays there's no space for those interactions that are, out of work or out of school, I mean in face-to-face meetings, as in, online meetings like what we're doing now, if this was like a professional meeting as part of a regular work day, then I can tell you that in such situations there are fewer microaggressions and fewer little jokes, because there's no time for that, because during such online meetings we're only focusing on the core of our work, and there's fewer other interactions. Now, of course, that is a bad thing that we don't have that. Although now there are more, actually, because we are going back to the world from before the pandemic. But this was largely not there. That meant that there were also fewer behaviors that were actually micro-exclusive. But yeah, that's probably just a side note. This also generated something else, because people were stuck in their homes. Many people who are experiencing such micro-exclusions were saying that they feel safer and that they would prefer working remotely, because working from home gives them more safety, as they don't have those microaggressions that they were experiencing when going to a physical workplace. But it's an interesting subject. It's interesting how on the internet we can handle and we can deal with this spreading virus of this harmful joke. Yes, when you were saying earlier that there is a lack of an institution to which we could report some breaches of law or some hurtful posts, I actually remembered Northern Ireland. I recently went to Belfast, And it's an amazing place. I actually witnessed this kind of situation because in Northern Ireland, if you see some kind of graffiti or a poster, anything else in the public sphere that may be labeled hate speech, then you call the police. And the police is required to, now I don't know how soon, but I think within several or a dozen hours, the police is required to take down such a poster. And that really works. Although Northern Ireland and Belfast, that's a post-crisis place. That is a place that has experienced conflict. And Belfast remains a city divided into different neighborhoods that are antagonistic to one another. That's probably why this is a very interesting place that has these institutions, and it's a place that learned to respond. And it would probably be great if something like this could function in Poland or on the internet in general, because each one of us, or actually I myself, had the feeling, the impression that I, reported something that was insulting on which social media it was, but it was one of the most important social media that I reported it to. And it turned out that the mechanism when I decided to report something, it doesn't work, and the person who is offending others remains with impunity. But if we don't have such institutional tools, then probably we should do something with our agency and make use of that. So I'm just wondering, how do we use our agency? Because most likely it's not about, because as we said earlier, sometimes we may use the wrong word or the wrong expression, or sometimes we can joke without any negative intentions. So probably what is important is when we're trying to, fix that small part of the world that surrounds us, it's important to do it, once again, in a way that is gentle and emphatic, to make sure that we leave some room for a change for the other person. If we want to show to that person that perhaps we could think differently, maybe we could joke differently, or we could use different words. Well, yes, this grassroots agency once again makes me think of education, although, well, that's not grassroots because it actually is institutional. But in the thinking of how do we change society, then on one hand, we have to penalize certain actions that should be penalized and are not in line with the norm. On the other hand, we need to shape this norm in the minds or behaviors of young people. So the way, children are raised in their homes, I can't influence that, but it would be nice if the parents would draw attention to this right away. So perhaps not through prohibiting or banning things, but through being more mindful, because I think violence and actions that are in line with norms, as I said earlier, I'm a big fan of Marshall Rosenberg and nonviolent communication, and that is all motivated by, unmet needs. Any such action or any criticism of the other person is something that tells us that there's unmet needs and need to be heard, to be seen, a need for attention, influence, and all of these needs are, I think that these needs are not talked about enough. At home, not everybody has the competences and the resources to do that. If this was done, then I would be doing that at the level of kindergarten and at school. Perhaps, and I'm not saying that, the models taken out of home are very strong, but maybe that would have a quantitative impact as well, and it would reduce the amount of acts of violence in our later life, because we would know better how to identify the need behind a certain behavior. And the fact that, I'm calling someone a name, or that I kick someone when I'm younger, or, also when I'm older. Or, for example, in relation to myself when I am violent, because self-destructive behaviors are also part of that. So I just believe that if we were talking more about emotions and needs, at that point, there's a chance that we're going to see fewer, and then we won't have to respond, we won't need to act reactively, but we'll be able to act proactively by reducing the amount of violence. I'm not sure if that's possible, and probably it's not possible without the action of, there have to be instances and institutions that do penalization, and when someone reports something, the law should be reinforced. So I think these are these two powers. On one hand, education. On the other hand, enforcing the law and social norms by institutions of the state or others. But yes, usually when thinking of reinforcement, we're thinking of these state institutions. But on a day-to-day level, as I said, this is about being mindful of ourselves. It's about conversation, but also, and by the way, this makes it easier for us to say that I'm not okay with what you're saying here and how you're saying it. So it's also important to respond right there and then, and it's important to talk about the consequences, the effect of what you're saying. So saying, well, when I heard you make that joke, I felt uncomfortable because that goes against me and hits me. When we share our emotions, the other side cannot deny that. This is just information that proves that something is wrong. Now, for the person doing the action, any information that shows them that something has been noticed and that something is not acceptable, that gives them that micro message. It's like a micro signal that their action is not okay. I'm talking now about people, of course, who are not psychopathic or, completely unusual in that manner. Okay, so mindfulness, being mindful, is at the core, and also the idea that language is powerful. I think that these are the two things that were very strongly heard, and they're going to resonate, I hope, to our listeners and viewers. They definitely will stay longer with me, because indeed, I believe we always need to be mindful, but we need to be mindful by being empathic to ourselves and to everyone around us. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. Margaret Amaka Ohia-Nowak was explaining to you and talking about this fascinating world of language and humor that is filled with very thin lines. So, thank you very much. Thank you very much as well. Thank you for the conversation and for your questions. Yes, I would also like to thank everyone who was watching us today. This was the 4th May meeting. It was our May webinar organized by the Polish Humanitarian Action. Thank you once again to everyone for your attention, and I wish you a pleasant evening, and see you and hear you a month from now.